Yeah. Okay. Bonjour mesdames et messieurs, et si vous n'êtes pas tranquille, je vais faire toute mon exposition en français. Okay. I have the distinct honor today to introduce our final speaker of the 2015 CUSLI conference, and that's Mr. Stuart Baker. We have spent this conference discussing issues including intellectual property, trade, the border, cybersecurity, innovation, and many other things to talk about. One of the things to think about when you're looking at the Canada-U.S. border, there are two overwhelming issues that are sometimes seem to be at odds with each other. One is increasing the efficiency of the border in order to help the prosperity of both our countries. And on the other side, we want to maintain a very high level of security, and we see the reasons for that. It's both well known. But there is a possibility that we can achieve both of these priorities using technology. So we're very privileged to have as our final speaker someone who is described as one of the most techno-literate lawyers around. He's had a distinguished career in public service, a very successful private practice, and here's a bit of jealousy, is a published author. Stuart Baker is partner at the Washington office of Steptoe & Johnson. He returned to the firm after 3.5 years at the Department of Homeland Security as its first assistant secretary for policy. Now, in this job, he was responsible for policy analysis across the whole department, as well as for the department's international affairs, strategic planning, and relationships with law enforcement and public advisory committees. He's going to be the one who wraps everything together and makes this whole conference make sense. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Baker. Thank you.
As my resume has gotten longer and the introductions of me require more talk, I have begun to aspire to give a speech shorter than my introduction. But notwithstanding the tendency of the reception, this is not your lucky day. I hold the record for returning to Steptoe from government more times than any other lawyer, but almost everything I learned about trade, government, and Canada I owe to Richard Cunningham. If you don't like what I say, blame him. And certainly, I got my reputation for being techno-literate, mainly by comparison to Dick. So my experience with Canada begins with completing the Coureur de Bois 100-mile from more or less Montreal to Ottawa, it was a remarkable experience in Canada's approach to large events, and I will never forget seeing the Canadian Army called out jeeps at every road crossing, troops shoveling snow onto the road so that we could just ski across. It was a great experience. I hope to do it again one day. The age record for completing the Canadian Ski Marathon used to go up every year with Jack Rabbit Johansson. He quit doing it at the age of 95, so I've got time before I have to go back. So I wrote a book about my time in government called Skating on Stilts that was really about the topic that we're trying to talk about today, which is how to use technology, how to confront technology, use technology in ways that will prevent some of the modern ills that technology also empowers. Someone on Amazon said, you know, this is a policy you can take to the beach. And that's because it has good guys and bad guys, it has a plot, it has narrative drive. Remarkably, although maybe those of you who've negotiated with them will appreciate this, turns out that the Dr. Evil of my book is the European Union. And I didn't cover U.S. relations with Canada. Probably just as well, because you would have ended up as mini-me. We had problems, which I'm going to describe, with Canada that were a scale imitation of the problems that we had with the European Union, which fortunately have largely been resolved. So what I'm going to talk about is what I see as Canada's strategic negotiating constraints and style for everything, and how that related to a particular problem, which was terrorism, what in Canada has been described as the thickening of the border, and then how we managed to get out of it, and the extent to which I think that digitizing the border has begun to thin it again. So let me start with what I see, from the outside, and having negotiated opposite Canadian participants, as Canada's sort of strategic imperative. Obviously, look, it's 10-1 in a fair fight. You might beat 2 Americans, but it's hard to beat 10. And worse, maybe from a strategic point of view, if you drew a swath 100 miles on each side of the border, U.S.-Canada border, and didn't count those folks, it's not 10-1, it's probably 100-1 or more, which means that for most of the United States, there is no perception of Canada at all. Even if you live along the border, of course, you've got a media that is principally focused on the U.S. But the fact that everybody, or large chunks of Canada, are close to the border and big chunks of the United States are not, means that the awareness of what's happening in Canada is near zero in the U.S. body politic, and it's highly developed looking south from Canada. So there's this enormous information disparity, there's an enormous size disparity, and that has had an impact the Canadian approach to negotiations. The Canadian approach to negotiations is to assume Canada will lose. It is a deep-seated belief that Canada loses every negotiation with the United States. This is not true, but in many ways it is true, because when the United States wants to do something, really has a determination to do something, they don't even notice that Canada is getting rolled over. We have currently the president who has a president who has never been more cognizant or more ideologically committed to the view that the United States often does more harm than good when it goes out to impose its moral view on the rest of the world. A man who believes in stepping back from international confrontation and letting others lead. He came to office, immediately said, well, that Keystone Pilot, that's just immoral, and has yet to notice, I believe, that there is a serious conflict between his commitment to internationalism and what he's doing in the Keystone fight. And that is typical of the way in which Canada loses. It loses fights that the United States doesn't even realize it's having. In actual negotiations, in my view, 90% of the negotiations consist of the Americans showing up saying, today, I think we got a picture. And the Canadians, having spent 4 months with 4-part mail analyses of how we should approach the coin toss. And, you know, the Americans say, yeah, you know, this is softball, right? And before they know it, you know, the Canadians are sliding into second, spikes high. That is sort of the part of the bizarre dynamic of the U.S.-Canadian negotiating position. That produces, to my mind, a couple of critical Canadian approaches to the U.S. on negotiating issues. First, if you're outnumbered 10-1 and you can be rolled almost without the other side knowing it, you have to count on what your advantages are, which is you follow the U.S. so closely, you know every nuance, and you're negotiating with people who didn't really notice that you failed to vote in the last U.S. election. And so there is a complete lack of understanding of the nature of the relationship, and it is easy in many cases to get the U.S. to agree to sound perfectly reasonable. There's an assumption on the part of U.S. negotiators, U.S. politicians, that we see the world exactly the same way. And often you can lock the U.S. into procedures, policies, dialogues that prevent clouds that you can see on the horizon from actually raining on the U.S.-Canadian border. And that is a big part of Canadian negotiating policy. We see the world the same. Let's set up a policy in which we bind you like Gulliver. The other issue that I've noticed about U.S.-Canada policy is if you're going to have a disagreement, you can only have one. You have to, the Canadian policy, stance to the U.S. government is almost entirely, and this has been true for 15 years, we see the world the same way. Great. It's so nice to be in that position. Things would be perfect if the United States weren't so unreasonable. And it's just this one thing. You know, used to be, remember, softwood lumber was it for years. And recently it's Keystone. And in the middle, it was us, DHS. So I know I spent 5 years in that position. I was the utterly unreasonable fly in the ointment to an otherwise perfect relationship. And so I watched this closely and want to talk a little bit about how we arrived at this and how we began to think about getting out of it. So after 9/11, the U.S. said, well, our line of defense is our borders, and we need to make sure people are not coming into the United States the way the hijackers did without us even being aware of their intent or their reputations. And so the U.S. adopted a set of policies that were very data-focused. We said we need to know more about who's coming, and we need to know that information before they show up at the desk in JFK for 30 seconds of screening. And so we began to ask for detailed information about people, both in visas when we started collecting fingerprints and then checking to make sure that the fingerprints matched when they showed up at the border. And we also, over time, implemented a system in which even the visa waiver travelers, the people who didn't need a visa to come to the United States from France, from the UK, from allies, put aside Canada, special case, but everybody else had world had a deal with us where they didn't have to get a visa, which means we didn't know until they got off the plane that they were coming. And we said that's not a good idea. We implemented a policy called ESTA, in which you had to actually make a reservation, not just with the airline, but with the country, and say, I'm coming, I'd like authorization to come to the United States as many times as I want over the next 2 years. That was designed to give us time to look at who was coming and to do some research on them. Then we began looking much more carefully at who was risky, gathering information from a host of sources, combining that information so that we could do, when we got a notice that somebody was coming, we could quickly pull biographic, in some cases fingerprint data, to say these are not people we want to have come, or these are people we at least want to question at the border before they show up. And then we began recognizing that it's easy to fake that if you can get a stolen passport or avoid the biometrics. We asked, actually we more or less told countries that were in the visa waiver program, if you want to stay in the visa waiver program, you have to adopt new security standards and lost and stolen passport disclosure reporting to stay in the program. So you had to have new security measures, electronic reads, and biometric into the passports. All of that was designed to do border screening, principally at the airports, in a much more effective and data-heavy way. It worked. We found a lot of people. We identified a lot of people at the border, and in many cases, we identified people to screen at the border who we discovered actually on the flights trying to do something, because Al-Qaeda believed that they couldn't get through the border defenses, but they could blow up planes before they landed. And that was a technique that they have been trying for some time and has led to further changes. That's great. Didn't really apply at the land borders a lot. You can't do at the land border, and maybe more importantly, Canada did almost none of those things. It didn't feel particularly threatened by Al-Qaeda and international terrorism. These were expensive things to do, and so Canada is not part of the visa waiver program. It has a visa waiver plus status in its relationship with the United States. But that meant we didn't have the leverage of saying, you know, you could lose that. And so in the end, we ended up with a situation where the visa waiver countries were doing far more in terms of cooperation with the United States, sharing data, agreeing to our security measures than Canada had done, because Canada was not subject to the same kind of leverage. And that led, really starting right after the lines went, you know, were hours long, but continued right through the imposition of additional Western Hemisphere travel requirements to what was viewed, and with some justice, by Canada as a thickening of the border. More formalities at the border, because we had no idea who had landed in Toronto or in Montreal the day before and might be driving across the border. We had to look for those folks. We could not rely on Canada to have done that kind of screening. That was the perception in the United States, and for years, Canada of those requirements and identified DHS's security concerns as the problem. There was a solution, and the obvious solution: practically all the foreigners who come to Canada come the way foreigners come to the United States. They fly in, except for people who cross the land border. And Hang on one sec. So we responded to this to the debate in DHS by saying, why don't we share data on the people who are flying in, and then we don't have to worry so much about who's crossing our land border, because we know everybody who flew in has been checked at least once. And all we need to do then is for Canada and the United States to have similar data gathering programs with respect to who's coming to the country, share information on who they think is risky, and adopt similar standards for checking the documents of people who are arriving in the country. That was a proposal that was made in the Bush administration. It got nowhere. And it got nowhere, I think, for an interesting reason. Basically, in my sense, many even were privacy, we can't share this information with the Americans, but just below the surface, and not very far below the surface, was Bush and Gitmo and the Patriot Act, and a sense, I mean, delivered by U.S. media to Canada, else, that you couldn't really engage in information sharing with the United States safely because of potential for misuse of the data. And what has happened, I mean, that essentially stalled all of the effort to build a North American NORAD type, as the ambassador described it, solution to this problem that would have allowed us to thin out the border. What has happened since then essentially is that we have, well, the biggest thing that happened was Barack Obama, right? No one felt about a Nobel Peace Prize winner that he was likely to steal your information and send you to Gitmo with it. And so the underlying fear and the strength of the privacy objections began to diminish, and the Harper administration, frankly, I think, rose to the occasion and said, you know, we can rethink this, and they suppressed a substantial amount of resistance from the permanent bureaucracy of the Canadian government, and entered into a beyond-the-border agreement with DHS around 2012 that has transformed the digitization and the use of data at the border. One example that is not terrorism related, the U.S., for a variety of reasons, wants to know who's left when they've left. And we keep track of people who fly out, trying to figure out, trying to stop everybody at the land border and say, you know, who are you, identify yourself as you leave, is going to be an enormous undertaking and a little bit silly because, you know, a quarter mile down the road, you are going to have to stop, and you're going to have to show all your documents to the Canadian border authorities, and they're going to keep a record of the fact that you crossed the border. It makes all the sense in the world for the U.S. to say, could you just let us know who left? And we'll do the same for you. When people leave Canada, you don't have to ask them whether who they are, because we're going to gather information as they cross the border. Made all the sense in the world, took forever to reach agreement on doing that, and we still haven't fully reached agreement on that. Only third country nationals are reported on, neither U.S. nor Canadian departures are kept, are recorded and shared across the border in this fashion. I think that's I'm going to identify a few problems as I go along just to demonstrate. I don't think we're quite at nirvana yet. Canada has said, we cannot accept and store information about Canadians who are leaving Canada. And therefore, U.S., when you gather that information, don't give us data on Canadians. And the U.S. said, okay, we don't have to give you that. You'll still give us information on Americans when they leave. And the Canadians said, well, no, you know, to be reciprocal. And if we have a stone in our shoe, you should have a stone in your shoe. And that is where it remains. It's a little bit silly. Since it doesn't have a big impact on security, I don't think it's the end of the world that we can't reach agreement on this, but it is a peculiar of how the negotiations have worked out, in which each country has projected its privacy limitations on others in ways that have prevented sharing of information. Bigger problem, I think, or maybe a bigger opportunity, is Canada has adopted at last a whole series of security measures that the United States pioneered. The ESTA agreement, which we said, you know, you have to make a reservation to come to the country, even if you're in France or the UK. It's not a visa. Just looks a lot like one served up electronically, but it's so easy that it's not a big deal, and we want to get the records. Canada has adopted that as well, and it will probably go into effect this year. The tie between the U.S. and the Canadian approach goes down to the very point that both of us wanted to call this the electronic travel authorization. And both of us were told by the Spanish government that ETA was not an abbreviation that they thought was appropriate. We put an S in there. I can't even remember what it stands for, but it's the electronic something travel authorization. Maybe that's it. And Canada made it a lowercase e, which I thought was typographically innovative. But that means that now Canada, too, will be able to screen people before they arrive. We'll get notice about people who are coming. There will be electronic transmission of the manifest, so they'll actually know when the person gets on the plane. Which gives you, you know, this is, thank goodness for the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, it gives you hours and hours to run the numbers and go through the databases to say, is there somebody on this flight that we really want to talk to before we let them in the country? Having that little opportunity to do that is very useful. Tied to that, actually, let me stop there for a second, because my second suggestion for things the U.S. and Canada could do together that would be helpful here is, as you begin to think about, you know, neither the U.S. nor Canada have been subject to filling out these forms. But the minute I started to think about what it must be like to get these these requirements, I thought, well, you know, if the Europeans ever do this, and they do it on a country-by-country basis, it's going to be a pain in the neck. I'm going to go to 4 countries, and I'm going to have to make 4 reservations. And then I thought to myself, well, that's how the ETA and ESTA are going to look from Europe, which raises the question why the U.S. and Canada can't do this together. One database, or at least one application form that goes to 2 places so that you get an authorization that allows you to come to 2 different countries. There are problems with this. Canada has VWP relations with a lot of countries that the U.S. doesn't, but that's, you know, that's what data processing is for. You can tell the difference between people who are VWP members for the U.S. and for Canada. I suppose there's probably some privacy issue someplace in there, because there always is, but in fact I think most people who make these applications will vote with their feet. If they're given an opportunity to say, if you go here and fill out the form, you can get an electronic authorization to go to both countries, a lot of people say, yeah, I'm likely to want to go across the border at some point while on my vacation. Why don't I just get both countries to get authorization? So that seems to me something that we should be thinking about seriously. Obviously, getting the information, knowing who's coming, doesn't tell you who's risky, and this is also something that the U.S. and Canada have now, under Beyond the Borders, begun to do, which is to share information about who we think is risky. We're sharing biographic information. We're giving Canada, the U.S. is giving Canada access to our consular database, which is full of all the intelligence that identifies people who are of concern. We're going to give them access to the to the ESTA database, so they know who we have told they can't travel without getting a visa. That information sharing is already underway. There is also information sharing from Canada to the U.S. Obviously, less information on the Canadian side in many of these cases because of the relatively smaller intelligence capabilities of a country that's 1/10 the size of the United States. But it is a highly effective mechanism, and it took a lot of courage, frankly, for the Canadian government to decide to do this. I think not just courage, but also a recognition that Canada is a target for Islamic terrorism and can't assume that it doesn't have the same problem the U.S. has. And then finally, we're going to be moving to biometrics and sharing data based on fingerprints as well. We do a little of this now, mostly for immigration purposes. Canada still doesn't. This is maybe another issue that is worth thinking about. Canada does not gather fingerprints when people apply for visas, and it mainly because it doesn't have a way to check fingerprints on the way in. But there are significant problems with the use of passports and visas that have been issued to one person by somebody who looks a lot like them. In fact, the two Charlie Hebdo killers, there's still some question about who actually went to Yemen, whether it was the guy whose passport went to Yemen or his brother. Without biometrics, it's really not possible to know for sure that the guy who got the visa is the guy who is showing up. And so a better biometric and more comprehensive biometric approach would make sense. And maybe most importantly, we are still in all of these cases, and this includes the information sharing and derogatory information sharing, excluding nationals of our own country. Obviously, there's more political sensitivity. Our assessment of our own citizens in both cases, but it's, yeah, I heard the ambassador say, well, we didn't give a passport to one of them and we took it back from the other, so you really didn't have anything to worry about. What that says is, we dodged a bullet. That does not mean that somebody the next time isn't going to cross the border, and it could be from south to north, it could be from north to south, and we're leaving open a hole if we do not share information about our own citizens across this border. Just to point out some of the U.S. failings in this regard. We have a law that requires us not to share information about applicants for visas under the Violence Against Women Act, women who were trafficked for sex purposes across international lines, victims of crime. Their information cannot be shared. I guess the assumption is that they would never lie about their identity, which I guess shows a touching lack of familiarity on the part of Congress with the sex trade, which is, nice, but a dumb restriction in this context. These, I guess I'll close by saying, these are small bits in a remarkably transformed relationship. If you look back 10 years to how bad things were, and you look now at how much cooperation there has been a total transformation of the relationship, and we have a basis for transforming it further and building a security system that is focused on the people who are flying in. and allows us to restore a much easier cross-border relationship. Or, as I guess I should say, you know, if now that we've finished this one thing, you know, really, we see everything the same way. Things would be perfect if the United States weren't so utterly unreasonable about that pipeline thing. So, thank you. Oh, I'll take questions. Yeah. Come on. Yes. If there's first question is for you. Is there somebody here that I haven't offended? I'll work on it.
Thanks, Stuart. Question for you about the biometric exit requirement that's probably been around since you were in DHS.
I did everything I could to dismiss and prevent it from going forward because I thought it was a complete waste of money and useless. This is the idea that we should take fingerprints from everybody who leaves so that since we took their fingerprints on the way in, we can take their fingerprints on the way out, and then we can match it all up, and we'll know who overstayed because we don't have their fingerprints, and the bookkeeping will balance. That's the theory, and there are people on the Hill who believe profoundly in this. I don't get it. If terrorists are leaving the country, God bless them. We already have their passport information, we have their manifest information. Adding the fingerprints will give us another 1% of certainty about who left. And since we don't have the resources to track them all down, last I looked there were 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States, and probably a third or more, 40% of them, came with some kind of legal authorization. So I think this is a red herring. I don't, and I've said that many times. What the U.S. what DHS is trying to do is build better biographic bookkeeping systems in the hopes of heading off the idea that we should stop everybody at the border and print them before they cross into Canada. That will never work.
So, well, I was going to have two questions. One was going to be, do you think the entry-exit exchange through Beyond the Border is sufficient as an alternative to getting everybody having to get out of their cars in Buffalo, get fingerprinted, and drive back over? The second is, I believe that they're going forward currently with a pilot project for exit, at least in the airport mode. Do you have any knowledge of that?
They are, and I haven't followed the details of that. We tried a few pilots as well, you can do it if you're willing to impose substantial cost on the airlines and on travelers, because after all, you probably noticed that you line up in airports a lot, and they do a lot of scanning of stuff. You could put fingerprints in there, and it would slow things down. You'd need a lot of readers because there's a lot of gates, or you could do it at TSA, but then you've got a whole bunch of people who are crossing into the checkpoint. So none of the solutions, to my mind, are particularly attractive from a cost effectiveness point of view, because I just don't think this is a security issue. It's a immigration enforcement issue, and it has about as much relationship to actually dealing with illegal immigration as building, a wall along the border does. That's not the problem, and that's the solution. Yes.
Again, I'm Dan Utso from Dickinson Wright. I was an American that worked in the U.S. government and Canadian governments, and at the worker bee level, and I just have to say that was the most accurate and eloquent statement that I've ever heard of the U.S. viewpoint on negotiating with Canada. That should be required viewing for anybody that operates. I would encourage people to go to Koosley.org, www. And I'm confident Dick Cunningham wasn't tweeting, but some of us were in that regard. Just a quick question on Just two thoughts immediately came to mind. It sounds to me that on each of these negotiations that it was always Canada coming around to the U.S. side of the argument, if you will, with some very limited exceptions. Were there ever times you saw us adopting the Canadian standard, or kind of did a little .I, or that at least we threw Canada a bone to say we understand?
Yeah, well, actually, I think lumber was not a route for Canada. In this area, no, I think at least at DHS, the view of Canada in that period when it was trying to prevent the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative from going into effect was that it was purely just fighting us on an important security measure, and it might have slowed it down, it might have made us more careful about doing it, but I can't think of something where we gave ground to Canada. But I guess the good news is we never said, hey, you're getting VWP plus and you're giving us VWP minus, we're going to put you in the VWP program, and then you'll have to do all this stuff. That would have been a nuclear weapon in the negotiations, and we never came close to doing that.
Can I follow the earlier question and do a follow-up as well? I'll steal Steve's mode. And setting aside government to government for a moment, with all of the advanced information that's being provided, the complaint of many of our clients and still the industry community is compliance cost, one, but two, we're submitting all this information and we're not seeing the trade facilitation benefits of this. We may be more secure, but where's the trade facilitation? Is it a matter still of infrastructure not being there? It's great to have an access card, but if you're sitting in the middle of Detroit-Windsor Tunnel and can't get to the crossing, or is it technology hasn't caught up to where we need to be, i.e. single window? Yeah,
I think on Nexus it is infrastructure, right? You can't devote a lane to it. You can't get to it. Well, you can, but it's getting to the lane that's the problem. Most of the travel facilitation, I think what people, again, mainly are not seeing is the disastrous lines that we had post 9/11. We're back to 98, 99.5% of the people who land a 30-second interview and welcome to the United States. The real risk would have been that some countries or a lot of people would have gotten secondary inspection that are not getting it now. But you can't see that as an improvement, because it just means you've avoided some inconvenience that you never have experienced. Yes, and I'm told I have 1 minute remaining. You have 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll be quick. One of the issues has always been data storage and how long the U.S. would maintain these records, and whether it would allow the creation of longitudinal files or data mining of these files for other issues like tax, criminal offenses, or whatever. How was that resolved?
We had a long negotiation over this. Actually, we had 42 long negotiations with the European Union because they kept coming back and saying that was a nice agreement, but we'd like more, so let's reopen it. But you should read the book. It's if you thought I was hard on Canada. The U.S. agreed to store the data for a shorter period of time. It's, I think, 5 years, and then it goes into a kind of, actually, it goes into a cold storage almost immediately. It's mainly used for screening. Goes into cold storage for about 5 years, and then if it hasn't been looked at, if there's been no reason, it goes into a deeper freeze and then drops out. But I think we have also discovered that every time somebody shoots up a Western country who is a Western citizen, everybody's really happy back to see whether they traveled to the United States, who they traveled with, what prints they left behind with us. And so it turns out that keeping this data for a period of some years, and I certainly think that 10 years is appropriate given the lifespan of evolution of radicalism, is a good idea. And we do have the information. We don't save it for as long or use it for as many purposes as we would have in the absence of the negotiations with the Europeans, but we do use it for serious crimes, and we do keep it for, if I remember right, on the order of 10 years. I'm going to be around after this, so I'm happy to talk to the other people I've offended who didn't get an opportunity to ask a question. So thank you very much.
Stuart, that was a great tour de force, and I realize that you feel beaten up by Canada, and most Americans do. Lovely legs. In closing up this 39th annual CUSLI conference, I just want to say a huge thanks to the wonderful speakers and panelists who've come here, who've prepared so diligently, who've shared so readily their incredible knowledge and wisdom. I want to thank all of the people in CUSLI itself who helped make this possible, our executive committee, our advisory committee, the two deans, the two executive directors, including Charles, who have worked so hard to make this possible, Emily, you and your crew. I also want to say that this just couldn't have taken place unless Case Western had been willing to add so much extra to it and give us Charlie on a full-time basis and make this happen. You deserve our thanks, and I, on behalf of all of us, do so with great sincerity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and a very special thank you to both Governor Blanchard, without whom we wouldn't be able to do this at all every year. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us at the 2015 conference. We're going to have a small reception out in the lobby here, starting right now, I believe. So let's head out there. For those of you who are attending the Cleveland International Film Festival event and reception that's being hosted by the Canadian Consulate, please look for Andrew Hupfau. We have a shuttle going down to City Cinemas that'll be leaving in about 25 minutes at what's that? Let's say 20 minutes, right? A little bit before 5:45. So everyone else can have more than one drink at the reception. So thank you again.